Michelle is Director of Conservation North. She's based in Prince George. She's a professional ecologist. Her work is in protecting primary forests. She's a great organizer and a great communicator, and I hope you'll agree with me after Michelle has made her presentation. Michelle.
Thanks to the Syilx people. I'm always struck by how beautiful the lands are around here and the differences in textures and colors of the lands here in contrast to where I come from in north central BC, which is the territory of Dakas people or the Lheidli. So I live in Prince George. My group is made up of volunteers. We're all volunteers. So I feel like I'm going to be saying a lot of things that people in this room already know. So thank you in advance for hearing what I have to say on behalf of our group. Also, thank you so much to Interior Watershed Task Force for organizing this. This is such a classy, well put together, well organized event. So thank you so much to you guys and for having me here to speak. So the ask right now coming from the environmental movement is to protect old growth, which is critically necessary. But today I'm going to talk about why we don't think that that's enough. When we first launched our group in 2017, we were most concerned with the loss of old growth forests in our region. In 2020, this changed, and today I'm going to talk about why. I want to say thank you to Elliot and Taryn for bringing other species into the room with us, because my first slide is going to be about that. So we know that many other life forms that we share the planet with are in decline. According to a global scientific assessment done in 2022, populations of animals with backbones, so mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish that are being monitored, have seen a 69% drop in their numbers on average since 1970, meaning that it's likely that animals we're not monitoring are experiencing something similar. These results are based on something called the Living Planet Index. In 2018, researchers did a comprehensive accounting of the body weight of life on Earth, or the biomass of life. They looked at wild animals and plants, as well as humans and our domesticated animals. It was a global snapshot of the abundances of life forms that we know of. And if we just look at mammals, 60% of mammals on Earth now are livestock, mostly cattle and pigs. 36% are human, and just 4% are wild animals. So the size of the animals in this cartoon, we're looking at the blue one, is meant to convey proportions. And if you look at what's in blue, the lonely rhinoceros below the human there represents all wild mammals. From research done in 2023, updated numbers show that the total weight of Earth's wild mammals, from black bears to elk, is now less than 10% of the combined tonnage of just men, women, and children living on Earth. So humanity is displacing wild animals and other life forms globally. When you think back into deep time, over billions of years, there's always been a background rate of species extinctions. But what sets our modern declines apart from previous ones is that modern rates are much higher than what happened before industrialized humans. So we're causing extinctions mainly by destroying natural habitats through agriculture, roads, urban development, mining, and logging. We started Conservation North because we think it's unacceptable to be driving other life forms into a death spiral, and we wanted to do something about it in our region. So I first learned about the Bower clearcut 20 years ago. A friend gave me a book about it. I was living in Vancouver. The Bower clearcut made Prince George infamous in the mid-80s because it was so large it could be seen from space with the naked eye. It is 300 square kilometers, or 40,000 hectares, the size of Texada Island on the coast. This extreme logging was a forestry response to a natural increase in the population of spruce beetle, which is a native insect that goes through ups and downs in its population based on climatic triggers, so temperature and moisture. Forestry has a few terms that sound innocuous, but mean something violent on the ground. Salvage logging is one of them. It is a term used in the forest industry to describe removing forests affected by insects and fire before they lose their economic value. And this is what took place in the Bower. The word salvage implies that something's being saved or recovered from these forests. In fact, logging a natural forest after a disturbance like a spruce beetle does major harm to the ecosystem. Lots has been written about this. But we haven't learned this yet. In the past few years, our region has seen large continuous clearcuts that are even more expansive than the Bowen clearcut was. Mike Morris, who's here today, was featured on CBC last year talking about this recent 3,000 hectare clearcut an hour and a half north of Prince George that had also been affected by an increase in spruce beetles and was consequently logged very quickly. So these are images of it. It's a popular myth that natural disturbances like insects, fires, and tree diseases require the complete annihilation of a natural forest ecosystem and its replacement with an artificial one, like we're seeing here. Doing this damages the regenerating plant community. It can damage existing seed beds. It compacts soils because you've got big machines, which affect plant germination. It can destroy plant material that survived the initial disturbance. And it removes standing dead trees, which is the most obvious effect of salvage logging, which are called biological legacies after something like a fire goes through. Removing the trees changes local microclimates and alters plant communities this way. And this is to say nothing of the wildlife. So these 3 species are red listed in BC and used this forest before it was cut. Mountain caribou, fisher, and northern goshawk would have continued to use these forests. And of course, our group is concerned with all organisms in our region that use natural forests, not just the ones that we know are in obvious trouble now. Among those who work in forestry, it's common knowledge that when beetle events take place, forest licensees or logging companies log trees that were not killed by the beetle. It's standard practice for companies to send people out to find spots where there are a few trees with spruce beetles in them, apply for a salvage license, and then log a far larger area than the beetle's actually in. The amount companies pay the government to log dead trees is very cheap compared to the normal cost. So they take advantage of the system. In the photo here is the parsnip drainage. It's on the way to Mackenzie, north of Prince George. This is old growth, wet spruce and subalpine forests with some mortality from the spruce beetle. You can see the reddish, brownish trees there. The cut we just saw photos of would have looked a lot like this before it was logged. You can see that there are many living trees, the green ones among the red ones. Both of these types of trees have lots of value. These old forests have multiple layers of trees of different ages and sizes with extensive root systems and mycorrhizal networks. The spruce beetle is a plant predator that hits some of the oldest and biggest trees typically. And when these events happen, overstory trees die, and then the trees that have been waiting just under them in the subcanopy grow quickly in response to getting light. These old forests evolved with the spruce beetle. In these forests, the beetle is how the oldest trees die. Forestry wipes out the structure of a forest, including the individual trees that survived the spruce beetle event. There's a researcher from Montana named Dr. Diana Six, who has studied the survivor trees after beetle events and has suggested that those trees pass on genetic resistance to the beetles to their offspring. If left alone, survivors act as seed sources and enable these forests to adapt to beetles and the changes in the climate that are going to be driving more of these disturbances in the future. So I'm talking about Prince George after all, and we like to commemorate clearcuts with beer. This is a craft beer from a Prince George brewery. Yes, it's called the Clearcut Lager. And it says on the can, the Bowen Valley Clearcut covers an area greater than 300 square kilometers. Necessitated by the spruce beetle epidemic, this clearcut represents the largest harvested area in the world. This is a good beer, by the way. I like it. I bought it. These are my cans. But unfortunately, the information on the side of the can is wrong. So no, the forest did not need to be cut because of the bark beetle. That was a purely economic decision. And unfortunately, it's not the largest clearcut anymore. So this kind of thing is the result of industry messaging that gets repeated over and over again, uncritically in newspapers and online until we all believe it. And this is what we're contending with as we try to protect natural ecosystems, including places that are hit by natural disturbances. When I did my studies at UNBC 13 years ago, it was on what happens following an insect disturbance in natural forests in our region. And I learned more about how our forests evolved with natural disturbances like fire, plant-eating insects, and tree diseases. So what wildlife need is what they've always had before contact and the advent of industrial forestry. Pre-contact landscapes were a mosaic, with some having lots of old, some having higher proportions of naturally young forest, depending on where you were. Wildlife and other life forms, plants, lichens, microbes, evolved to fit the conditions of unexploited forests like the ones in these photos. Diversity in plants and animals is related to having diversity of natural forest ages and structures, and those things emerge from the accumulation of natural disturbances of various kinds, intensities, and sizes on the landscape over time. When a natural disturbance is severe, so it kills a lot of trees, say over 70% of the dominant trees, the forest inventory database of the BC government will record that age as being young again. So it's no longer technically old growth. The age on paper of that forest gets administratively reset after an insect or a fire goes through and is a severe one. Does this mean that these areas are any less ecologically valuable? No. A healthy ecosystem requires death. So when it gets hit by a severe outbreak, the age gets reset. So the photo on the left is in the Goat River area in the Robson Valley. We encountered a grizzly bear rooting around for food in there when we visited it. There were tons of dead trees with big hollows in them that are perfect for hibernating and giving birth. And in the photo on the right, you can see all the wildlife trees, which will last over centuries because they've been wildfire hardened. This is a schematic of how a forest develops over time. So every old growth forest you've ever set foot in has had many natural disturbances over the years. All old growth forests in BC owe their structure and complexity to the natural workings of insects, fire, and disease. And the thing that nobody tells you is that in order to have proper old growth forest, you need to protect the system that created it. If we log all the young and middle-aged primary forests in BC, the ones that recently had fires or insects or had them 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 70 years ago, we will never again have naturally regenerated old growth forests. You won't get a forest of an advanced age that was self-willed, self-regulating, and self-managing if you log all the younger primary forests. And this is actually what's set to happen. When you log an old growth forest, it takes several generations of the oldest trees dying and rotting to create a load of dead wood, so fallen rotting logs on the forest floor, like what's in the photo on the upper left. This is essential wildlife habitat. It's not simply a matter of just waiting 150 years for the trees to grow. You need to wait long enough for enough of them to rot and fall over before it will look like a proper functioning natural forest again. If we just look at the BC government's forest inventory and see that a plantation, say if we fast forward 100 years, and we're seeing in the inventory data that a plantation is now 150 years old, we assume that it looks like an old growth forest that we're familiar with now. But that's not the case because it's just the dominant living trees that are that old. It will take several more generations of tree death and decay over time to get the important structures wildlife need back, the standing dead trees and the fallen rotting logs in particular. And this is what we're losing. What effect does this have on the salamanders or the voles and the mice, which are the base of the food chain? Younger primary forests might contain structures that are 500 years old. The photo on the top left is a mature forest because the dominant trees have not quite met the arbitrary cutoff for being considered old. But that log represents unbroken natural forest development over maybe 500 years. So we're underestimating by probably 2 to 3 times the time it takes to get back attributes that primary forests have, like rotting logs, which of course get crushed by machines when logging happens. And this is why our group expanded our concern to all primary forests from just old growth, because we're pulling the rug out from under all our natural forest ecosystems by only protecting what's old now. We think that naturalness is more important than age and that at this point in time. It's understandable that the focus has been on old growth. The mainstream environmental movement emerged from coastal BC, where you have temperate rainforests where you don't get big fires, for example. In the interior, our forests are more dynamic in general, as everyone here would know. And of course, older, bigger trees were what the traditional sawmilling industry went for throughout BC. But the pulp industry and now pellets are different because they can take a lot more species and quality of tree. So as people not on the coast, we need our own goals that take into account the ecology of our forests. In our Seeing Red map, which is here, what's green represents never logged forests of all ages, and red shows what's been industrially logged at some point in the past. So old growth is a subset of what's showing here in green. Also, this map underrepresents historical logging because the spatial data don't go back that far. So the red will be bigger than what's actually showing here. And anyone can just Google Seeing Red map and this will pop up and you can zoom to any spot you like in BC. So natural forests are like a pot of boiling water. If we imagine that this pot represents primary or never logged forests and the bubbles represent old age classes, at any one time, 10 or 30 or 50 or 70% could be bubbles, depending on the forest type, whether you're in the Okanagan, in Treaty 8 lands in the Northeast, in the Great Bear Rainforest, in the Skeena. Every ecosystem will have a different proportion of bubbles. Natural forests are always changing. And if you're an osprey looking down at an intact valley, so say a valley that's never had any roads or logging in it, you will see a very slowed down version of this pot of boiling water. Some of the stands will be ancient, some will be mature, on the cusp of being old, and some will have had a recent fire where seedlings will grow shoulder to shoulder with newly created wildlife trees. Healthy ecosystems are constantly changing. My point here is that bubbles of old growth require that the entire pot of primary forest be left to its own designs. Any type of rotational forestry stops this process in its tracks. As I mentioned before, we seem to value forests based on the age of the dominant trees, but this is not how a lynx, for example, sees her habitat. A 200-year-old natural forest will contain snags, hollows, rotting logs, all of which are 2 to 3 times the age of those dominant living trees. The true age of a 200-year-old primary forest in terms of the structures and habitat it produced might be closer to 400 years. If we acknowledge this, then we're committed to the conclusion that primary forest habitat is functionally irreplaceable. To keep the pot metaphor going for a second, climate change is turning the element up on the pot of water. And in this context, the last thing we want to do is log these ecosystems, not just because logging them creates large amounts of carbon or releases large amounts of carbon, which make climate change worse, but because we would destroy their ability to adapt to future conditions. That's what my group's really concerned about. Also, in general, primary forests tend to be more stable than managed forests. So this is a photo of a BC special. It's a huge plantation west of Prince George in Sycus territory. And to read an excerpt from these researchers here that are from all around the world, they say, a large body of literature shows that forests managed for commodity production, degraded forests, are generally more susceptible to fires because of drier microclimates and fuels, higher land surface temperatures that promote air movement between forests and neighboring open areas, and human ignitions due to access and proximity. The last one there is pretty obvious. Why does any of this matter? The idea that we need to log primary forests is being weaponized against nature now more than ever because the industry is getting desperate for raw material. Climate change is freaking people out, as it should. It's causing more frequent and larger natural disturbances, and the public is rightfully worried about fires in particular. The problem is that what's being proposed to solve these issues will make things much worse for nature and us. The message around logging more primary forest as a kind of solution to climate change is becoming more pronounced. What we're hearing from industry professionals and the BC government and even some academics is that we need to destroy more primary forests in order to save them. So this message is coming from places of authority. It was brought to my attention recently that in the Kootenays last summer, some of the priority deferral old growth burned, a fire went through. These were accepted old growth deferrals, so they were approved by the rights holders there, by the First Nations. Instead of leaving those forests alone, industry is raring to get in there and log them. And my guess is that that will happen. And this is the vulnerability of all old growth forests, that they become not old anymore, owing to a natural disturbance. And then all of a sudden they're back on the chopping block. That is that they become not old administratively anymore. That's the risk. The power of the message of old growth and its importance evaporates when these forests are no longer labeled as old or are considered administratively as old. In the past, the Trojan horse for logging primary forest was the effect of the disturbance itself, the dead trees. What I'm hearing and seeing now is that arguments are being made for preemptively logging natural forests because there might be a fire or an insect. So the threat of industrial logging is now on both ends. Those who stand to benefit from doing this are getting away with this in two ways. The first way is that they're doubling down on what they've been saying for decades. Things that kill trees are bad. Logging is the only logical response to that. The top clip is a US Forest Service publication. I'm sure you guys have seen this before. It just says, bark beetles are the most destructive insects in Western coniferous forests. There's no mention of the fact that our forests, evolved with them for thousands of years and that they belong here. And below that is something funded by the Future Forest Ecosystem Scientific Council, which lives in the Chief Forester's office. And it says, natural and human-induced disturbances such as wildfire, insect and disease outbreak, wind throw, and forest harvesting are important drivers for forest renewal, post-disturbance stand structure, and ecosystem function. So they very sneakily struck logging into there. So most of that is true, except for the part about harvesting. So they're equating large-scale industrial tree removal, logging, with things like fire and disease, even though on the ground, the effects of logging have little in common with what natural disturbances do to the land chemically, physically, and biologically. The second way they're convincing us that further logging of primary forests is a good idea is that they're framing what they do as being good for nature, actually. So this is it's a paraphrased quote from American psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, where he says that people that do bad things will always have a virtuous sounding rationale for it. So his quote is something like, every atrocity requires a claim to virtue. And what we're seeing is the rebranding of primary forests as unhealthy, waste, residuals, low value, low quality, damaged, diseased, fire prone. And we first noticed this in 2020 after realizing that some forest types in our region, in the Amanika, were being referred to as bioenergy stands in official documentation. So they're earmarked for pellets. This is an interview with a prof at UBC Forestry who is talking about primary forests without actually saying that. He's making an argument for replacing what he calls low-grade fiber and low-quality fiber with what he calls a healthier forest. So, i.e. logging natural forests and replacing them with plantations will make them healthier. This press release came out of the BC government 3 days ago and includes a quote from the Council of Forest Industries that says that logging these burned forests are a form of restoration. Linda Cody said, quote, salvaging wildfire damaged timber on a timely basis can help restore areas for wildlife. That is total horseshit. I also find it quite... I also find it quite sinister. In two recent meetings that I attended on behalf of Conservation North with Ministry of Forest bureaucrats and staff on the Old Growth Strategic Review and on forest landscape planning. So these were two different things, two different meetings. They repeatedly mentioned natural disturbances getting more prevalent and how these things are changing and things are more challenging and all that, with the heavy implication that those forests require management. And we all know at this point what that means. So props to Skeena Wild, which is a group in Northwestern BC, for making this scandal public last summer. which was that the BC government canceled 1.3 million hectares of lands in the Skeena that were set aside for conserving wildlife habitat, and they opened them up for industrial logging. So BC Timber Sales has subsequently gone in and flagged them out. The government spokesperson that was quoted in this article in the Haida Gwaii Observer said, the specific areas are part of small-scale harvest, including removing single trees to address beetle kill and promote ecological resilience. The idea that logging in beetle-killed forest somehow promotes ecological resilience is a fiction and a fairy tale. They are damaging wildlife habitat and they're claiming they're enhancing it. This is a whole other level of, to quote Taryn, effed. We cannot let the idea take hold that industrially logging natural forest increases resilience or health, or whatever positive or technical sounding words BC government people pull out of the air, because these things are not true. Right now, the Ministry of Forests and the Water and the Ministry of Waterland and Resource Stewardship have competing mandates and objectives. And as far as I know, there is no legislation being crafted at the moment to back up Waterland and Resource Stewardship's mandate, which is to support old growth forest protection and protect wildlife. Primary forests are complex systems. They have hidden wiring. We don't understand them, and we cannot recreate them once we've destroyed them. I want to add a tiny thing about messaging. We hear a lot of messaging about clear cutting. In our view, it's not an effective message because it's interpreted as meaning that we're okay with other forms of industrial logging and primary forest, and we aren't. We would never simply make this statement just asking for one method of industrial logging to be stopped, because it's our view that all industrial logging should be excluded from natural forests, not just clear cutting. Alternatives to clear cutting are always gamed by industry, and alternative logging does not help nature. It damages it slightly less, and that's not what we're going for. Protecting old growth is not enough to sustain nature in BC. All remaining primary forests should be protected from all forms of industrial logging, and we should focus our efforts on better managing second growth. So that's where we think better management belongs. It's going to be this generation that decides if we can recover our biodiversity or if we lose it. And I'll end off with these quotes. And I want to just to bookend what I said at the beginning. The coastal environmental movement is demanding old growth protection, but this leaves other ages of primary forest vulnerable. And we as an interior focus group really think that we need to actually say what our forests need and what nature needs in our area. These are two quotes I stole from David Broadland's Evergreen Alliance website. So this was from Lois Mannion, who wrote this article that was published just the other day. He said, extinction should be a source of public outrage because it is the absolute confirmation of environmental mismanagement at the public expense. I would highly recommend reading this article, which is on the Evergreen Alliance website right now. And then David Broadland had also posted this quote, which says, silence gives consent. So I'll end it there. Thank you very much, everybody.